Hello and welcome to Birthright, a War Stories Take Action discussion about women's healthcare, women's reproductive freedom, and women's bodily autonomy. I'm Civia Tamarkin, the director of the film Birthright, a War Story, and I would like to thank all of you for joining this discussion and for your support of our film, its messages, and its mission. We began the film Birthright, a War Story with the intention of creating a wake-up call. For that, we are deeply grateful to the women who so courageously shared their painful experiences on camera so that the public would become aware of what is happening to women across the United States today. Now that we have created awareness with the film, we are moving on to the next phase, which is an impact campaign to call for action. We are trying to mobilize, to spur involvement, to build momentum so that the messages of this film can serve as a catalyst to bring about political and policy changes. That is the purpose of this discussion today, to explore what actions we can all take to ensure the fundamental constitutional and human rights of every woman, and to stop governmental and religious intrusion into women's health care and medical decision-making. Michele Goodwin is a professor at the University of California, Irvine, and a legal and global health scholar. She is widely known for her research and publications on the topic of policing the womb and the public health consequences of criminalizing pregnant women. Brigitte Amiri is a staff attorney with the American Civil Liberties Union and deputy director of the ACLU's Reproductive Freedom Project. She recently has been in the news as the attorney defending both the civil and reproductive rights of teenaged immigrants who are being held in detention in Texas. Tarah Demant is the director of the Gender, Sexuality, and Identity program at Amnesty International USA. She has also been involved in Amnesty's reports, Deadly Delivery, which document the high maternal mortality rate in this country. Welcome, everybody. So I would like to open by asking, how desperate are the times? How concerned should we be with the state of women's health and women's reproductive rights and freedom? Let's begin with Michele.
Well, these are times that are quite troubling, actually. And if we put them in context, we can understand why. So in 1966, Dr. King received Planned Parenthood's inaugural Margaret Sanger Award. And the speech that he wrote for it is quite riveting. And I would urge any of the people who are viewing to actually read the speech. And he spoke about the intersection between civil rights and women's rights as being a very important space. He said that there was no way in which women who were poor were going to achieve a quality stance in life, nor with their children, without being able to control their own reproductive health care. In fact, the words he used were urgent and necessary, that women, poor women, white women, women of color, have access to family planning. In fact, he also said that it was cruel to force a child into a life in which it was not wanted and where the parents could ill afford to have a decent standard of living for that child. He said it was also cruel for women to be placed in such a condition. And he further narrated his speech by saying that in a country where in the early days, an agrarian economy where women might have had 10 kids, that simply was not sustainable in the modern times, in the times in which he was giving the speech in the 60s, in which people were moving into urban areas and living in tenements. He said you could not raise 10 kids in any decent, dignified, humane way, 10 kids in a tenement. It's also worth noting that at that same time, George Bush, shortly thereafter, this is George Bush 1, played a pivotal role in the enactment of Title X legislation that was signed into law by Richard Nixon. And George Bush said at the time that that people would come to see the sense of this, the importance of poor women being able to have access to family planning. Nixon signed it into law. It was passed by Congress. Even George Bush 1's father, Prescott Bush, was the treasurer of Planned Parenthood. Fast forward to today, Title X is being gutted, and what remains of it is threatened to be eviscerated. There are significant attacks on Planned Parenthood and, in fact, on reproductive health care providers generally. And not only in that space, women themselves are suffering under attack, being threatened with arrest and incarceration for falling down steps, for taking illicit drugs during pregnancy, for not taking illicit drugs during pregnancy. Women are being threatened with arrest for refusing a C-section or attempting to commit suicide. In Alabama, just within recent years, more than 500 women have been prosecuted for, air quote, for harming their fetuses or threatening the health of their fetuses. These are very scary times for women of any reproductive capacity, because much of this does not make sense. And let me close with suggesting why, in fact, this kind of era of targeting women and their reproductive health is so dangerous. The United States now leads all developed nations in maternal mortality. And in fact, if you look at the CIA data, that's Central Intelligence Agency data, you'll see that the US ranks around 50th in the world. It's actually safer to give birth in Bosnia than it is in the United States. And Texas is now considered the deadliest place in the developed world for a woman to give birth. That makes absolutely no sense. And I think it's very fitting on the 50th year anniversary of Dr. King's passing to reflect back then on that message that he had more than 50 years ago about it being urgent and necessary and humane for this nation to be mindful of and about women controlling their reproductive health care.
Yeah, I mean, you really put your finger right on it earlier when you talked about the question, like, what's at stake here? And the answer is that women are dying, and the women are dying at rates that are unnecessary and preventable. And maternal death in the United States, 50th in the global world, that's the worst of any developed nation. It's also deeply unequal, and you spoke a little bit about this too in the connection to access to other rights like the right to vote. But, you know, to give birth in the United States is a very dangerous proposition for women and other pregnant people. It's especially dangerous if you're African American and you're 4 times more likely to die in childbirth than a white woman. If you're Native American or Alaskan Native, you're 8 times more likely to die in childbirth than a non-Native woman. And those aren't accidents, right? Those are deeply connected to the denial of other rights that happen in the United States: the rights to vote, the rights to access government, the rights to participate, the right to access healthcare. These are all interrelated. And what's at stake, other than basic denial of rights, the right to choose your number and spacing of your children, the right to live with dignity, the very right to life as you embark on pregnancy, like, what's at stake is people's actual lives.
Well, this is the part
yeah, go ahead.
That's disconcerting to me, if I might join in, which is that in so many of these cases that we're seeing that are really so, and unfortunate doesn't capture it, so deadly, is that these are women who are looking to carry pregnancies to term. We actually don't do a very good job at all for women who actually want to be mothers. And so in so much of this space, it's become politicized, as in how terrible women are when they want to control their pregnancies and possibly even end a pregnancy. But what I think the film does so well is to speak to women who want to be pregnant and maintain a healthy pregnancy, being targeted by police, being harassed by prosecutors, being targeted by their doctors, and unfortunately dying in the United States.
So what I was going to say is
perfect storm that we're in right now of the state restrictions piled on top of the federal attacks. And so we have all of the state restrictions that have passed since 2010 and the ones that are still being passed right now on top of what's happening at the federal government. So we have the Trump administration passing new regulations, rolling back access to contraception, and also I think we'll be talking about prohibiting unaccompanied immigrant minors from accessing abortion. So we really are at an unprecedented attack on access to reproductive health care in a way that I think we may not have previously seen.
And those things are related, right? I mean, we mentioned Texas earlier. It's not a coincidence that Texas, with some of the most restrictive access to abortion laws, without comprehensive sex and sexuality education, without access to healthcare, without access to preventative care, then there is the highest maternal death rate. Like, that's not an accident, and it's not. It certainly doesn't take a health scientist to figure out, although they have, that those things are directly correlated, right? So when we talk about the broad range of restrictions, like, they end in this same picture, which is the unnecessary preventable maternal death.
Well, I think it's also important to think about where these occur, just as you're saying, in Texas and so many of the states where the stakes are high for women and for their infants, also happen to be the states where there's the least representation of women in political office. So at the Center for Biotechnology and Global Health Policy, we've engaged in a research study because we wanted to know, well, where are women the healthiest? And in those states, we wanted to be able to measure, well, what does it mean to be a healthy woman? What does it mean to be a healthy infant? So, of course, you want to look at maternal mortality rates, infant mortality rates. We look at women's survival post-cancer. We also look at things such as whether sex education is being taught in the schools or it's abstinence only, et cetera. And what we found was that in the states that had the least representation of women in political office, those were the states that were the most deadly for women. There was also a very strong indication between that and also abstinence only or no sex education in schools.
Well, at the ACLU, one of our tools obviously is litigation, and I'm a litigator, and so we have probably more than 24 lawsuits pending right now, both at the state and federal level, challenging restrictions, as do our counterparts at Planned Parenthood and the Center for Reproductive Rights. So that is a huge tool that we have in our toolbox. And then it is people having their voices heard before bad legislation gets passed and turning up at the state houses. And I have to say that, there are so many amazing images of people turning out in droves that we have seen in the state houses, and people who are really fired up. Obviously, I mean, one of the silver linings is we talk about silver linings all the time because we have to, given the current climate, is the activism that is happening. And so the fact that people are really standing up to be heard and pushing back on their lawmakers, saying what policies they don't want to see enacted, is really heartening. So it's having your voices heard. And if that fails and a law gets passed, then we do our best to strike it down in court.
And the ACLU has done a fabulous job. There have been some real victories. But I'd also say that one of the challenges has been, and it's been shocking, which is that even after the decision in Whole Woman's Health, which struck down 2 of Texas's TRAP laws, shortly thereafter, there were states like Minnesota and others that were basically putting back on the table the very same types of laws that had been struck down by the Supreme Court.
Yep.
Now, of course, that means that these would be laws that, if enacted, would be struck down again. But the problem is that for the time in which they're there and they're enforced. That's problematic for the women in those states. And the other thing is that it incurs significant costs for the women, their attorneys, and organizations that then fight laws which the Supreme Court has already struck down. In that way, it's something that is so absolutely absurd, not something that one typically sees.
Question.
Should we repeat the question since folks can't hear Civia?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's a good idea.
Okay.
So the question was, what's the role of the courts nationally and internationally? Certainly nationally, Brigitte, I'll kick that to you. But internationally, I mean, there certainly is a role for international actors. The United States is bound to a number of international treaties and agreements, and in those is a basic right to equality, so equal access to healthcare, to medical care, to pregnancy care, and pregnant people are especially noted in international law and policy as needing and deserving particular care. And the United States is bound to those treaties. I mean, the problem with international action on that case is a treaty is only as good as a country is willing to uphold itself to it, and we've not really seen that.
We've not had a great history there.
We've not had a great history with that. But certainly those are standards by which we understand their international measures. And I think for normal people and for ourselves, like those measures matter, even if they don't matter to the leadership. And I think that's something worth taking to the, when you are talking to your representatives, when you are, if you're not the lawyer in the courtroom, like you're talking to decision makers, making sure it's clear, like they're internationally agreed upon standards. These aren't just things the United States makes up in a bubble. So that type of there are international litigative options, certainly with the Inter-Americas courts, but ultimately it comes down to folks within the United States demanding change from their own lawmakers. It's certainly the way I think we're going to see the most amount of movement on this.
And at the domestic level, in terms of holding states accountable, I mean, that's the bread and butter of what we do is sue states to prevent them from enforcing their unconstitutional restrictions on access to abortion. So that is, precisely what we do. And we do our best among the various organizations to go after the laws that are threatening to close down the clinics that shame and stigmatize women, that make it more expensive or harder in terms of travel time to get access to abortion. And so that is one of our big strategies is litigation in courts holding states accountable, and now the federal government too.
Yeah, and Brigitte, I wanted to get back to something you were saying about, maybe it was Michele, about when, these cases have gone through and Texas, for example, has been thrown out of the Supreme Court, but what you see are other states trying to reintroduce this. And so I think one thing that's important is that it should be very clear to everyone that like rule of law and, a rights-based framework is not actually at the interest of people who are pushing restrictive laws. And neither is, of course, like safe pregnancy and safe childbirth. Right. What's at the root of that is controlling women's bodies.
This is absolutely right. So the reason why I think it's so important that we understand the historical landscape is that these are not one-offs, meaning that these are just not matters that began today, but what we see are historical patterns that at a particular time in our history were interrupted by Roe v. Wade. You see, the power of Roe v. Wade was that in 1973, in a 7-2 court opinion, for the first time, if you pay attention to Supreme Court jurisprudence related to women, it was the first time the Supreme Court relaying women are human beings. Oh my goodness. Women are stigmatized. Women are stereotyped. If women do not have the opportunity to control their reproductive health care, sometimes they will actually die. And the Supreme Court goes through this. The Supreme Court actually articulates that, in fact, when abortion became criminalized, it was at a particular time in which there was this kind of heightening about vice in the United States, but abortion had not been illegal in the United States. I mean, the Pilgrims came to the United States and they performed abortions, right? I mean, and so what Roe does so brilliantly is to show that women had control of their reproductive health care. And when they lost it, this is when, in fact, women became also marginalized in many other ways. And I think it's worth noting, too, that prior to the at the time of the Civil War, nearly 100% of women's reproductive health care was actually controlled by women. 50% of midwives in the United States were actually African-American women. And I think it's also worth noting that it was a political campaign to get midwives out of the work of doing OBGYN care, right? This was at a time where the American Medical Association developed committees to try to help criminalize midwifery. It was a matter of monopolizing care over women and pushing women out. So many people don't understand this history. The other thing that people don't know is because of the way in which this has been traditionally framed, you would think that the craziest thing for a woman that she would possibly ever do would be to think about terminating a pregnancy. But the reality is the World Health Organization has consistently said that a legal abortion is as safe as a penicillin shot. And the second thing that I think is important to know is that the empirical literature has always shown that terminating a pregnancy is actually safer to a woman than carrying one to term. A woman is 14 times more likely to die by carrying a pregnancy to term. Now, we may not like those odds, but that is the reality. But what's very interesting is the way in which there's been a distortion in terms of the framing. So I think it's really important that we understand this history and that we also understand the science and medicine around reproductive health care, which people really don't know.
Yeah, Brigitte, I'm wondering if in your in the courtroom and in the battles that are happening around, particularly around abortion restrictions, are you seeing similar trends in, say, something Michele spoke about earlier on criminalization of pregnancy and, the cases we've seen, I think higher profile cases like Bebe Shwe or the case of Patel, but also the criminalization of drug use by pregnant people or of certain behaviors, seatbelt laws that criminalize pregnant people and women, particularly for driving without a seatbelt when pregnant. Have those things come up in that? Because I think, we've been talking about, people see this a lot as like abortion or not, and really it's about so many more things.
It is, absolutely. And these trends of states, Michele talked about Texas and the high maternal and infant mortality rate in Texas, which is the most heavily restricted in terms of access to abortion. And I think Michele also mentioned the criminalization of behavior in Alabama. Alabama is one of the most restricted states in terms of access to abortion as well. And I think that there's no coincidence there either. I mean, this is all a concerted attack on women's ability to make decisions about their bodies, bodily autonomy. And the ACLU is involved in some of those cases. Obviously, National Advocates for Pregnant Women is a huge leader on those cases as well. We're often playing a friend of the court role when we're involved, but there's no question that this is part of the whole attack on women's ability to make their own decisions.
And, people don't take that as seriously as they should. It's kind of, in one ear and out the other. And I think that's because there have been so many advancements that women have made within the academic space, the corporate space, legal space. And we could detail how there's a clustering that takes place or where there's a shrinkage of the pipeline, the higher up they go. As I think within law, 50% of the people who enter law school are women, but only 17% of the partners actually happen to be. But what I think that people really, fail to understand is that when women, it is about controlling women's destinies. And if you look back at early cases in the Supreme Court, they explicitly say that. In cases where women want to vote, they say, well, no, you should be at home. You shouldn't be out voting. And in early cases where women are petitioning to the courts so that they can become lawyers and doctors, the courts are saying, well, it's through divine order that you're supposed to be at home, and your delicate graces are only meant for you to be at home and not in competition with your husband and not to be using reason and things like that. So if you actually look at those cases, they kind of fit the narrative that's talked about now, where women are not actually supposed to be in the spaces where men have happened to have occupied and monopolized those spaces.
Yeah, and on a broader trend, I mean, we at Amnesty International have seen, broader human rights trends too in societies and places where women's rights, and particularly reproductive rights that have a huge impact on women, that when those are curtailed, the rights society itself, like these are a broader question of rights and a broader question of access for women. You know, in a place like El Salvador, where there's a total ban on abortion, it's totally criminalized. You know, women are going to prison for suspected abortions if it's a miscarriage, right? They still could serve 30 to 50 years in prison. And I think what's so alarming, and what people here in the United States should be alarmed about, is that is happening here in the United States. And the numbers of cases may be fewer, but that state by state, we're seeing cases like that. Indiana, obviously, is one example of that. And that's a threat not only to a woman's individual ability to control her life and her destiny, but to all of us, whether or not we are procreative, like our own ability to access rights. Like these are part of a broader attack on human rights, and part of telling people what they can and can't do with their bodies is part of a much broader anti-rights agenda. And I think that's something certainly we've seen in the last year and a half, like a very specific anti-rights agenda. And this is one, but this sort of intensity is one part of that.
Absolutely. And so, you know, we use the word intersectionality a lot, but, you know, that our work is particularly in this last year so intersectional. And, you know, the case that has been consuming me is the Jane Doe case, where the Trump administration has decided to ban access to abortion for unaccompanied immigrant minors. And these are young people who have come across the border on their own, often fleeing violence in their home countries. And when they come to the United States, usually seeking to be reunified with family members here in the United States, they are detained and held in private shelters that are funded by the federal government. And a Trump appointee by the name of Scott Lloyd has decided that he is going to prohibit access to abortion for these young people after he first tries to coerce them to carry their pregnancies to term by forcing them to go to an anti-abortion crisis pregnancy center, by telling the parents in the home country against their will. He has actually personally flown to meet with young women who were pregnant and considering abortion. And it is stunning. And so this idea of, you know, not only the importance of the role of the courts, but also this issue of we know that the Trump administration is anti-immigrant, anti-women, and this case is the confluence of both of the hostility for those two issues, and also speaking of history, and I know Michele will jump on this as well, that historically, politicians have always gone after the most marginalized when it comes to access to abortion. And you saw it right after Roe versus Wade was decided. When Henry Hyde, the politician out of Illinois, enacted the Hyde Amendment, he basically said, if I could, I would ban abortion for all women. I can't. So instead, I'm going to pass a restriction on Medicaid to make sure that they don't get their abortions covered by Medicaid.
Right. Right. Well, in fact, and to be clear, that the predecessor to Hyde was Helms. Mm-hmm. And it's worth locating that because in a conversation about the international impacts of U.S. policy abroad and the global gag rule, otherwise known as the Mexico City policy, which prohibits providers that receive and NGOs that receive any funding from the United States, such as USAID, humanitarian funding, cannot even mention the word abortion, let alone counsel in this domain, perform research or anything like that. Well, you know, who was, you know, Senator Helms? Senator Helms was notorious for being misogynistic, notorious for being homophobic. Notorious for his very Jim Crow-esque racial views, was not a person to self-edit those views at all. And he was the person who then launched what became known as the Helms Amendment, which laid the platform for all of the kinds of restrictions with U.S. funding abroad in relation to abortion. And this is the same year that the U.S. Supreme Court rules in Roe v. Wade to decriminalize abortion and uplifts women. It's the same year that in our Congress, the Helms Amendment moves forward. And just as a little historical note, how pernicious this was, that even though he pushed for it, he actually refused to vote for it because he didn't support U.S. humanitarian funding abroad. So all of those who who ended up conceding to his demands and okay to get him on board. In the end, he doesn't even sign on to the legislation because he actually doesn't support developing countries receiving U.S. humanitarian aid. And that is just how pernicious that piece of history happens to be.
Right. And a point of clarification for folks who might not sort of track in these terms, that the Helms Amendment is an amendment that means no U.S. money can ever go to abortion services, to abortion counseling, to any type of information about abortion or trying to liberalize abortion laws. And gag, the global gag rule or Mexico City policy, which was decided by the United States in Mexico City, I'm sure my Mexican colleagues would want me to point out, it has nothing to do with Mexico. That means that organizations and hospitals can't use their own money to do that type of work. And that's, I'm so glad you brought that up, because then another term, the Helms or the Hyde Amendment, which is no U.S. money can go to U.S. women who seek abortion, and that's in places like Medicare. The global impact of these decisions can't be overstated. Just like abortion restrictions in the United States, the Helms Amendment and the global gag rule means pregnant people die. It means women die. It means that people can't access basic reproductive services. In the case of global gag and the Helms Amendment, it also means there's increases in HIV/AIDS rates. There's decreases in use of contraception, right? Because that aid is so heavily tied down.
And to be clear, we also know that in those spaces, well, two things. We know in those spaces, it actually does not eliminate or reduce the incidence of abortion. Instead, illegal, dangerous, unsafe abortions always go up in the time periods where the Mexico City policy is in effect. And I think it's also important to know that even though there are exceptions that have been carved out associated with the Hyde Amendment, such as to save the life of the woman or in cases of rape or incest, the barriers and the burdens are really quite high, because doctors wait to get reimbursed for the government, but the government actually makes it very difficult in those instances to actually be reimbursed.
Yeah, and the threshold is very high to prove those exceptions, right? So you have a chilling effect of folks who don't want to take that risk of not being able to prove that the life of the mother of the pregnant person was at risk. So I know Civia's had some technical difficulties, as folks who are listening and watching can see, but we do have a number of questions that I have that folks have asked before, and so maybe we can get to some of those. There's quite a bit of interest around Catholic healthcare in the United States, so I want to read one question for all of us to respond to. So even though Catholic hospitals are privately run, how can they dictate to women that she has to have a C-section when her choice is vaginal birth? Or how do they approach conversations, let's say with a Jewish mother or a doula is one of the questions. And also, how can they restrict people who have legal rights? And I don't know, Brigitte, if this is something you have all dealt with intimately, I think at the ACLU and in national law, maybe you can kick us off.
Sure. So I'm not aware of situations where a Catholic hospital has said, for example, that a woman has to have a C-section. The issue comes up in the context of Catholic hospitals imposing the ethical and religious directives for healthcare, which are written by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops on their patients. And the way that I have seen it, but happy for Michele to jump in here too. But the way that I have seen that played out is in the context of miscarriage treatment. Mm-hmm. So when a patient presents at a Catholic hospital and she is pregnant and she is miscarrying, she does not receive the proper treatment because of the prohibition on abortion, even in the context of treating a miscarriage where a woman might die. So we see it primarily in miscarriage management, which is mismanaged, and in the context of tubal ligations at the time of delivery, which is prohibited by the ethical and religious directives. And getting your tubes tied at the time you deliver a baby is the safest and most effective time to get your tubes tied. And there is a prohibition on that in Catholic hospitals. And so there are other ways in which the ethical and religious directives for healthcare manifest to deny patients proper care. But those are two that I'm most familiar with. And the short answer is, can they do this? We think that they cannot, and have brought a number of lawsuits to try to prevent that. One tool is a federal law called the Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act, EMTALA, which says that all hospitals that run emergency departments that get federal funds have to ensure that a patient that comes in its doors is stabilized. They can transfer the patient after she's stabilized, but first you must stabilize. And there's no abortion exception. So if the medical treatment is needed that it's needed to stabilize the patient is an abortion, then the hospital must provide an abortion. And clearly there are violations of this in the context of the woman we represented, Tanisha Means, in Michigan. We know there are other circumstances. We also have a lawsuit pending right now in California under California law against Dignity Health, one of the largest healthcare hospitals systems in the country, saying it's a violation of California law. And we brought a couple of different legal theories there, saying that they can't prohibit tubal ligations at the time of delivery. So we're trying. It has been an uphill battle, but I think the public awareness has increased tremendously, just even in the last few years. And so I think I think we're at the beginning of the bottom of the mountain, and we're slowly pushing up.
Yeah, and Michele, with your, we're all about to wrap in just a few short minutes here, but with your, I think, long view to history, I'd love to hear what you think in terms of, where you see this arcing. Like, do you agree with, Michele, or both with Brigitte, that we're at the bottom of that mountain? Do we see a light on the edge of that horizon? And what is the role of people who don't work for the ACLU, who don't have a court case, right? Like, what is the role of social movements in this? And what do we think people can do? And we'll end with that question for each of us.
Okay. Well, social movements play a vital role. I have to say that given that some of my forebears were born in Mississippi, born during Jim Crow, experienced what it was like for family members to suffer lynchings and deprivations of rights, of education, and so much more. And when one appreciates that history and those people who not only survived it, but survived it with such grace and dignity, such as to forge paths for civil rights, then I must see hope, right? You must see hope when you see all of what women struggled for. The marches across the Pettus Bridge were not for naught, right? Rosa Parks standing up because, in fact, she knew about the horrors of Emmett Till and so many other things. Many people don't know that she was a warrior for women's rights, right? So we stand on the shoulders of these amazing, amazing folks. And in fact, we have, in thinking that way, we've been victorious. I think what we must be mindful of is that we can't forget. And that's the challenge, because things have been so wonderful in some ways in terms of breaking through barriers, that we've forgotten about a period pre-Roe and what that meant for women dying on their tabletops, dying in bathtubs, dying in the back of alleys. And I think not only have people who have been very embracing of women's rights forgotten about that, so have lawmakers who've been resistant. They have forgotten about the realities of maternity wards in New York and in Chicago that were full of women who had barely survived these horrible, botched and back alley, abortions. So in taking that long view, I think that there is a promise and there is a hope, but we must be vigilant and we must be educated. And I think one of the things, and I'll close with this, that we see today, I think much in terms of the kind of political space that we're in, with seeing so many people ostracized, stigmatized, and really, wondering, is this a country that's embracing of them? I think so much of this is rooted in a lack of education. Mm-hmm. I think it's important for us to be a much more aware and much more engaged country, not only on these issues, but on so many more. And so I commend Civia for this fabulous film and for many of the people who agreed and volunteered to tell their stories in this film. They were incredibly courageous, and I commend them all.
Thank you. And Brigitte, in our last minute, do you have words of wisdom for what folks can do to make a difference, to support the ongoing criminal and litigative efforts, but also in their own lives?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, and I think that Michelle's absolutely right that the courage of the people in the film and the people who are standing up and having their voices heard in any of the activist spaces are so incredibly important. And so I would say, have your lawmaker on speed dial and understand what your state lawmakers are doing, what your federal lawmakers are doing. Have your voice heard. You can volunteer at a number of organizations that are in your community that support access to women's health care. And I 100% agree with Michele that it's education and engagement, and everyone can do that. And if we all do, I think that I have hope too that we can change everything. If I didn't have hope, I wouldn't be able to come to work every day. But I do have hope, and I think that we will get there together.
Wonderful. Thank you. I mean, so if folks are wondering, that number to put in your phone for Congress is 202-224-3121, and that will connect you to your members of Congress. I think having your representatives on speed dial, making sure the power of that cannot be overstated, making sure that your representatives, no matter how pro-rights they are, no matter how anti-rights they are, hear from you consistently and know that they'll be held accountable is huge. So I want to thank both you, Brigitte and Michele. It's been such a pleasure to be on this panel with you. For all you who are listening, you can visit Birthright Film at Twitter, Birthright Film, for more information and to find out how you can show a showing of this video in your own communities to make sure, as we've been saying, that people are educated and they're ready to fight for their rights. So again, at Birthright Film, and that Congress number again is 202-224-3121. Thanks everybody who was listening. Thank you, Brigitte, Michele, and thank you to Civia, who has been chiming in offline here because of the technical difficulties for this incredible film. It really is such an important and timely piece for us all. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Sarah.